a universal system versus the King's Indian attack. I'm not an expert in any of these lines, but the system that I'll recommend is played by modern day grandmasters. And before I go on to share with you some details or information as to how to play versus this opening system that white employs, I want to go ahead and explain to you from where the opening gets its name and the distinction between the King's Indian attack and the ready opening. Now, the first thing we could talk about is where the opening gets its name from. Some of you might be familiar with the King's Indian defense, others are not. Let me show you some moves. D4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight to c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, knight f3, castles, bishop e2, and here we have what we would call the King's Indian defense for black. Black will either play e5 or play knight b to d7, and that's a very classical and distinguished opening system for black. Now, the King's Indian attack is basically the same opening or the same defense, but with the white pieces. So white will typically play knight to f3, and let's just do any moves for black. e6, g3, bishop g2. This is the structure that white aims to achieve, okay? And that's why the opening is called the King's Indian attack. Now, the reason why I want to point out or to make a distinction between the ready and the King's Indian attack is because the system that I recommend, there could be some transpositions to both of these openings. Now, for those of you that are just starting out, please, just try to ignore this introductory part or confusing part of the lecture, and I'll address your concerns in a moment. Okay, so with the black pieces, we could transpose into the ready in the following manner. White will play knight to f3, and the system that I recommend is d5. Okay, now the King's Indian attack are solely the positions when white plays for e4. Let me show you what positions those are. Let's say g3, knight f6, bishop g2, c6, d3, bishop f5, castles, e6, knight bd2, h6, knight bd2, h6. And now here there's a crossroads for white. The King's Indian attack is when white plays e4 or 4e4. But if he plays c4, then we're playing a ready opening, okay? Now, I know that this might be confusing, but it's important to make the distinction, and I will address both of those positions in the lecture. Okay, now for players that are just starting out or that have a rating below 1600, how could all this information be beneficial, or this lecture be beneficial to you? What I'm going to show you is what type of position you should be striving for as black. Okay, so let's say white starts off doing these King's Indian attack / ready opening moves. We play d5, g3, knight to f6, bishop g2, c6, d3, bishop to f5. So far what we have to understand is that we're placing the pawns in a triangle shape, okay? And we develop our white squared bishop outside of the pawn structure. So the pawns are in the white squares and the bishop is developed outside of the pawn structure. Castles, e6, knight bd2, knight bd7. And now the following moves, I'm going to make some pointless moves for white so that you get to see what type of structure you should be aiming for as black. a3, bishop to e7, h3, castles, b3, h6. This is the type of position or where you should develop your pieces when you're playing versus these openings as black. Okay, so if you could take a snapshot of this position. The rest of the lecture will be just supplemental information as to how to play this position. And for those of you that are above the 1600 rating or 1400 rating, then the theory will be more beneficial for all of you. Okay? All right, so let's go ahead and start off by talking about the theory of the King's Indian attack. So after knight to f3, we play d5, g3, c6. This game is between Rafael Vaganian, which is a top Armenian chess player, versus Lenier Dominguez, who is the leading Cuban chess grandmaster at the moment. Bishop to g2, knight to f6, castles, and bishop to f5. Okay. d3, e6. Now here white could play knight b to d2, and later on he'll proceed with queen to e1 to play e4. But white chose a more flexible move order, and that's queen to e1. This is an accelerated queen to e1 variation. The idea is to play e4 here, okay, and to prevent the exchange of queens when pawns are exchanged. Okay, h6, whose idea is to hide the bishop if white threatens to capture it. Knight b to d2, bishop to e7, and now e4. Black plays bishop to h7. Okay. Now in this game, Vaganian chooses to play knight to e5. Typically, white will play queen to e2, followed by rook to e1. And the way you should play as black is to castle. Okay. Rook to e1. And play a move like queen to c7. Okay. This is important to understand. Why? If we play knight b to d7, which is a very natural move, developing your minor piece, white will play e5. And now your knight doesn't have a square to develop to. Knight to e8 is not the type of square you want to develop your piece to, or the knight to. Okay. By delaying the development of the d7 knight, let's say by queen to c7, now if white were to play e5, we could play knight f to d7. And later on, we'll play c5, followed by knight to c6, and we're pressuring the e-pawn in a very French defense type of fashion. Notice that the f5 bishop, the f5 bishop, the white squared bishop, now the diagonal is being opened, and what black is going to do is that he is going to try to play on that diagonal, but also he's going to be attacking this e5 pawn after c5 and knight to c6. So in some instances, he might be able to play bishop to f5, followed by bishop to g4, and trading one of the defensive pieces of that pawn. Okay? So, in the game, Vaganian chose knight to e5. Some other details of this position are the following. Let's say white plays rook to e1 here. Okay, and we play queen to c7 because we're aware that white's plans is to play e5, and we don't want to develop our knight to e8. How would we continue with our development here? Well, white will have to answer that question. If he plays b3, we play a5. Okay. So that later on, our knight will be developed to a6. Okay, and when white plays e5, we play knight f to d7. Okay. Now, you could search for games from this position, and you'll have viable examples or very good examples as to how to develop from here on. But with the information that I've given you so far, you should be able to reach a very good position as black. I mean, this is good enough information for a player of master level. That detail of understanding where to develop the knights is very important in this structure. Okay, so let's go back to the game. Vagonian played knight to e5. Okay, his idea is to develop rapidly on the king side. f4, queen to e1 is a move characteristic of the King's Indian, queen to e8, and that is, in the King's Indian, the idea is to defend the knight on h5, but also to later on have the ability to develop the queen to the king side. And so white is basically doing the same thing here. Knight to e5, knight b to d7, knight takes d7, knight takes d7. Notice that here we don't go queen takes d7 because white will have e5 and white will have a very big advantage because the knight does not have any good squares. Notice that if knight to g4, we lose a knight. And if knight to g8, we're playing without a minor piece. The knight has no squares to develop to. Okay? Okay. So knight takes d7, f4, the accelerated King's Indian attack, castles, king to h1, and now black has to make a very important decision, and that's how to play or how to approach this position. Where is he going to develop his pieces to? Okay, he chose to play pawn takes e4. Pawn takes, and now knight to c5, pressuring the e pawn. The game continued. Queen to e3, queen d7. Now what white wants to do, or what black wants to do, is take control of the open file. If, for instance, some of the problems that white is going to have in a position like this is how is he going to develop this the c1 bishop. So let's say if after queen to d7 he plays b3, then I might want to play rook f to d8, so that after bishop to b2 I might have options of playing a5 and a4. Okay, obviously this hangs a knight, but those are just some of the details of the position. Okay, so queen to d7, a4, rook f to d8, knight to b3, knight takes b3, queen takes b3, and bishop to c5. Here we're reaching a position near equality. Black has no problems with his development. The only problem he does have is that this bishop is not as is probably, there is a chance that there will be problems with the h7 bishop, because at some point white could play f5, and let's say after pawn takes, the bishop could be trapped in that position. And if we were to compare the white squared bishops, then blacks would be inferior. So that's the only thing that I see in the position that that could be of a problem for black. But other than that, his position is very solid, and he has no problems with development. So let's see how the game continues. bishop to c5, and now white plays g4, which is what we were just talking about. Now he's threatening to play f5, and if he manages to play f5 and the bishop is trapped, then white will have a decisive advantage in the game, because black will pretty much be playing, or essentially be playing, down a piece. Okay, so let's see how white counters, or black counters, that move. This will be a very good strategic position to solve for anybody watching the lecture. So how would you play here as black? Black played queen to e7. And the idea of this move will soon be evident. f5. Now how would you proceed? h5. And that's a beautiful move. The idea is that if pawn takes h5, then I could just capture on f5, for instance. Pawn takes, and let's see. Queen to h4 is a good alternative. The thing here to understand is that black gets the initiative, and now it's very possible that our bishop is not going to be trapped on h7. So the game continued. Pawn takes c6, queen takes c6, queen takes e6, pawn takes e6, and pawn takes h5. Now white is up a pawn, but black, now this bishop, even it's not, there's no risk of it being trapped, and black has the initiative. Rook to d4. Now we're creating threats. Bishop e3, rook to c4, threatening the pawn. Bishop c5, rook takes. Now we're threatening this pawn, and also rook to e5. And this game should end in a draw rather shortly. c3, rook to f8, rook takes f8, king takes f8, bishop f3, rook e5, rook e1, rook a5, rook d1, king to e7, preventing the rook. b3, b5, a takes b5, rook b5, b4, a5, liquidating in the queen side. Pawn takes, rook takes, king g2, rook c5, rook a1. Notice that here, rook d3, defending the pawn passively. Then we play rook to c. Let's see. We could play rook to c4, and after rook here, we could play e5 here, and this position is still hard to win for white, because if he wants to activate the bishop, this pawn will be hanging, and what black will do is play something like rook to a4, followed by activating his king and also menacing the white king in the position. So okay, rook to a1, king to f6, The idea is to play king a5, rook a7, bishop g8, e5, rook takes e5 check, bishop takes c6, and the players here agreed to a draw. Now, this is a very instructive game because it shows a very modern approach as to how to play the King's Indian attack, and we learn middle game themes of the opening. Let's see if we could go over those themes very quickly. Let's have a recap of this position, okay? Maybe we should start from the beginning. Knight f3, d5, g3, c6, bishop g2, knight to f6, castles, bishop to f5, d3, e6, and queen to e1. Now, as mentioned earlier, knight b to d2 is a common move order, but Vaganyan chooses a modern approach, which is to play queen to e1 first. h6, knight b to d2, bishop e7, e4, and bishop to h7. Okay. Now, in the King's Indian attack, white plays queen to e2 here. And the most important thing to remember, or the detail here, is that we want to delay the development of the b8 knight. Because if we were to play knight b to d7, that's a positional error after e5. This knight has no squares. The only square it has at its disposal, it's the g8 square. And we're giving white way too much in this position. White will just play rook to e1. And meanwhile, while black figures out how to develop his g8 knight, white has developed a phenomenal lead in development. Okay, so the detail here is to delay the development of the b8 knight. So we will play, let's say, castles, rook to e1, queen to c7. And so now if white plays e5, we play knight f to d7, and then we'll later on play c5, followed by knight to c6, and sometimes we'll play bishop to f5, followed by bishop to g4, threatening to exchange the defensive piece of the e5 pawn. And also after c5, we'll play something like c4, undermining the diagonal. And with the knight on c6, that leads to things like knight to b4 and knight to c5, threatening many things on the white squares. Okay, so let's say after queen to c7, white doesn't push e5 and he goes for something like b3. Then we just play a5, followed by knight to a6. And now if white plays e5, we could play knight f to d7. So this might be a lot to absorb just from this position, but if you view this part of the video 2 or 3 times, or the video in its entirety 2 or 3 times, you'll be able to understand how to play the position. Okay, so how did the game continue? The game had a very modern approach to the King's Indian attack, and that's knight to e5. This is an accelerated way of playing the position. He wants to play f4, followed by g4. Okay, so he wants to attack on the king side. Knight b to d7, knight takes, f4. Black castles, king to h1, and here we have a very important decision for black, and that's how to continue in this game and which side of the board does he want to play, and he chooses to play in the center. Pawn takes e4, pawn takes e4, knight to c5. What is the idea here? The idea is to play to play in the center. He's going to play queen to d7, attack this light square, and place one of his rooks on the center squares. Let's see how the game continues. Queen to e3, queen d7, a4, rook f to d8, knight b3, knight takes, queen takes. And the only detail in this position that the one thing we can't forget is that there is a threat here of blocking this bishop forever, and that's by g4. And so this is the main thing, or concepts of the game that we have to remember. Queen to e7. And after f5, h5. Pawn takes e6. Queen takes, pawn takes h5. Even though white is a pawn up, we no longer have that burden of having a trapped bishop. And after rook to d4, black has the initiative, and he shouldn't have any fear or worries of losing the game because of his pawn deficiency, because black has enough dynamic chances in this position. So I think this is enough information to cover the first part of how to play versus the King's Indian attack. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Until next time.